Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war, where we start out in the Luhansk-Kharkiv border, where we see that the Russian forces managed to make a small advancement here to the north of the village of Kislivka, as they are now advancing in the direction of Avdiivka as fighting is taking place within the village, with the Russian 1st Tanks Guards army using a lot of their forces in this direction as they try to pressure the Ukrainian forces fighting in this area. We see that over the past few months there's been a lot of strikes of Russian side on Ukrainian bridges across the Oskar River line. This has put a strain on the Ukrainian supplies going all throughout this whole area and this part of the front line. With that, they are now launching constant attacks and raids across the front line, trying to pressure the Ukrainian forces. And now we're seeing an attack towards Avdiivka as the Russian forces try to establish a front line by the rail lanes as they try to cut off the supplies going to and from Kislivka and Kotlyarivka, as we've seen them previously multiple times attacking these two villages to no avail. So with this, they are changing up their strategy by cutting off the supplies rather than storming them directly. Although these villages are small, underestimating the Ukrainian forces is a huge mistake, especially when they are on the defensive. So we see that the Ukrainian forces are able to hold back the majority of the Russian forces after a lot of fighting. However, we see that the Russian forces managed to advance here to the north of the village and now contest the village of Avdiivka here to the north. So the developments here, although they don't have a huge impact on the whole situation across the front line in this section, it still allows the Russian forces to pressure the Ukrainian forces in different parts of the area, forcing them to relocate their forces and adapt to the situation while the ongoing fighting by Avdiivka continues. But before we get to that point, we have to look at the central part in the direction of the city of Orlivka to the north of Donetsk, an area that has been under Russian control and DPR control since 2014. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces for the first time managed to advance in this section of the front line, where they're fighting over this hill located here to the west of the city. And with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces are now entering and opening a new part of the front line. This indicates that either the Ukrainian forces have gathered a large amount of troops in this area and the Russian forces haven't detected them or responded in time, therefore leaving the Ukrainians with a massive advantage, as the fortifications here in this part of the front line are giving the defender a big advantage. We see that the Ukrainians, despite that, managed to advance in this section of the front line. So with this, we see that there are some developments here in the direction of the city of Orlivka. Finally, in the direction of Avdiivka, we see that the Russian forces, mostly the Wagner forces that have been readapted to the Russian army through the Rosgvardia units, combined with some DPR forces, have managed to capture most of this industrial zone here to the south of the city. According to some pro-Russian reports, they have captured all of it. However, there's been some geolocated footage here from the edges of the forest line in the southern parts of Avdiivka, as is shown on this picture here. With this footage, we saw that Ukrainian FPV drones hit some Russian soldiers fighting at the edges of the forest. With this, we see that the Russian forces most definitely have reached the forest line. And with this, there is an indication that the Russian forces may have captured the whole industrial zone here in the southern parts, after a lot of struggling and fighting in yet again an area that has been somewhat stable since 2014. The Russian forces have now been able to capture the industrial zone, which is a very fortified zone here to the south of the city. We see all of the trenches all throughout this section of the front line. We see the trenches here and in the northern parts and so on. So this industrial area, despite being an industrial area, also has the additional defenses of these trenches. So the advancements here are very significant, especially with how the other parts, the other section with all of these trenches everywhere, is now cut off from supplies to the north. With this, the Russian forces are now able to pressure the Ukrainian forces here in the central parts. And if we take a look at Deep State Maps map, we see that this whole section here to the south of Avdiivka is separated from Avdiivka with a huge forest section. So with this, we see that the situation is very complicated for the Ukrainian forces in this section of the front line, as with the capture of this industrial section of the front here in the southern parts, we see that the Russian forces have now pushed most of the Ukrainian forces into the forest areas, and with that, they are able to use bombs such as thermite bombs to bombard Ukrainian positions within these forest areas, leaving them very vulnerable as the forests are very weak to these types of bombs. There's also the COS systems, which also give Russian forces a big advantage when it comes to fighting in these forest lines. So we see that the Ukrainian forces are now in a peculiar situation as they are being pushed away from their heavily fortified positions to the south of the city into the forest areas, where the Russian forces will now have a much bigger advantage than what they've had previously. And this is all due to the return of the Wagner forces actually having the guts to storm into these fortified positions and take control over them in record time. This leaves the southern flank of Avdiivka vulnerable, as the Ukrainian forces will have to relocate a lot more forces to hold back the Wagner advances here in the southern parts of the city. And with this, we see that the Russian forces will likely restart operations here in the southern flank to try and reach Severne here in the western parts of the city and towards the heavily fortified area in the central parts of the city. As for the northern parts, we've seen that the Russian forces have managed to advance these two sections over the past 24 hours. With this, we see that they are now pressuring the Ukrainian forces on the eastern parts, both from the Kamyanka direction, but also from the Krasnohorivka direction. And they have also been closing in on the coke plant here in the northwestern parts of the city. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are trying to reach and storm the Avdiivka coke plant as well. And with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces are essentially being heavily pressured from all directions, both to the north, east, and south. And with that, we see that the Russian forces also continue their operations in the northwestern parts of Krasnohorivka in the direction of the railways, and across the railways in the direction of Stepove. So we're seeing that the Russian forces, after concentrating their forces in this section of the front line and bringing in new reinforcements to counter the Ukrainian reinforcements that arrived as soon as the Russian offensive began, they are now regaining the initiative and started advancing here in the northern parts. And with the Wagner forces in the southern parts storming the industrial section, they've managed to advance there as well. And with all of these advancements, there also comes a heavy cost on both sides, as fighting gives a lot of casualties, especially in these heavily fortified areas. Therefore, we're seeing propaganda PR operations on both sides. We have this video here of a Russian soldier setting up a Russian flag in the section of the front line here in Avdiivka. I'm not sure if it's from the north or the south, as I've not been able to geolocate it, but they managed to set up this flag at a position that is likely a hill, and therefore they are able to raise the morale of the Russian forces as they see the progress with their own eyes fighting in that section. There's also these advancements which we haven't seen in quite a while, especially in such a heavily fortified area as Avdiivka. And with these minor goals, such as using all of these forces to capture the city of Avdiivka, which is a huge feat in and of itself, as it would give this city of Donetsk a large enough buffer zone to avoid most artillery fire within it, allowing the Russian forces to use it as a massive supply hub for further operations in the Donbas region, as well as taking down the biggest and final massive fortification center of the Ukrainian first line of defense here in the Donbas region. If the Ukrainian forces lose Avdiivka, they will have no massive fortifications here in this section of the front line, as Marinka is completely destroyed. Avdiivka would be taken. The northern parts would be away from this part of the sections, more in the Bakhmut front. And Uledar itself is heavily fortified, but it's very isolated, which means that if the Ukrainian forces lose Avdiivka, they would be threatened on this whole section of the front line, as the Russian forces would be able to heavily fortify and resupply their forces in this section, allowing them to concentrate a lot of forces and thus launch many operations in this section of the front line, similar to the Ukrainian forces throughout the Zaporizhzhia offensive. With the proximity to Zaporizhzhia city and their control over the main supply routes in and out of the front line, they were able to concentrate a lot of forces and keep an offensive going for 6 months. If the Russian forces do the same in the Donbas region, they're likely to make some advancements, especially in the direction of Pokrovsk, which is a main supply line for the Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region. It would also allow the Russian forces to, instead of storming the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, to instead go around it. However, going around is not something that they've really been doing throughout this war. They've mostly been focusing on storming head-on, like they've done in Bakhmut, and which they're doing in Avdiivka. But of course, this is a follow-up to a partial encirclement of the areas. So we may see some sort of operation where the Russian forces focus their attacks here to the south of Konstantinivka in a north-going direction, and push from the Bakhmut direction towards it, attacking it from two sides in a smaller pincer maneuver, attacking bit by bit instead of these large-scale operations to try and grind down the Ukrainian forces and win through the battle of attrition rather than a battle of territory. It seems that the Russian strategy of this war is not to take control over Ukraine, but in a similar sense as World War I, where the fighting wasn't really about taking territory, but instead grinding down your enemy's forces to the point that their government collapses. This is why we're seeing the whole Western saga of sanctions. But then again, the Ukrainian governments are facing its own problems with the delay of the election that was supposed to take place here in late 2023/early 2024. It has so far have received a lot of conflicting information, whether it is delayed or cancelled altogether until the end of the war. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot of issues with the Congress failing to pass a bill to further supply the Ukrainians with the weapons they need in the new fiscal year of the US government. That is due to the new speaker being elected, being against supplying weapons, further weapons to Ukraine without them documenting exactly where that money goes. So with all of these changes, it becomes more and more difficult for Zelensky to get the necessary help he needs, the military aid he needs to win this war, and therefore they're facing extensive problems akin to World War I style, where governments would collapse due to lack of supplies, especially the German one, because of the British blockade, making it difficult for them to supply enough food for the local population as well as the army. And we see now the Ukrainians are going to be facing yet another winter with a heavily damaged energy sector and with the issues with Poland, Slovakia and Hungary due to the border disputes with the grain deals ruining the market for local farmers in those countries. There's a dispute there as well. So Ukraine is generally facing a lot of issues, both diplomatic, economic and morale based. Although their army is able to fight, they cannot fight without weapons, and all of these issues in their home makes it very difficult for them to focus on fighting. Therefore, I have talked with one Ukrainian soldier who claims that the front line, the soldiers fighting on the front line, are more concerned with the internal politics of the country rather than what's actually happening at the front line. And therefore, we see that there's a lot of developments that is outside of the control of the military, and that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.